of the concerns about the euro, people are not as concerned about the dollar as they should be. In fact, the dollar was the beneficiary of that concern. The dollar was being viewed as a safe haven. And so a lot of the money that's fleeing the eurozone is ending up in the treasury market. And that's creating an artificial demand, a short-term demand for U.S. treasuries and dollars. In fact, whenever anybody around the world is worried about something, and believe me, there are a lot of things to worry about, we benefit. Because when anybody is worried about something, they buy dollars. I'd say the worst thing that would happen to the U.S. economy, short term, would be that everything got better. You know, if Europe solved its problems, we're going to be in a difficult situation. Because if the world suddenly became a safer, friendlier place for investors, who would want treasuries? Who would want 10-year treasuries yielding 1.6? Nobody. Well, how's the government going to function? You know, I read an article, just I think last week, that our total net interest payments on the national debt for the last year was like $356 billion was the total that we paid on 16 trillion of debt. That was 2%. Right? 2% on 16 trillion. In fact, the amount that we're paying is less than half of what it was 10 years ago, even though the debt is more than twice the size. So, the only reason that we can handle a $16 trillion debt, and of course, you know, when I talk about the 16 trillion, I'm talking about a small part of our overall debt, even though that's a huge number. That is just the bonds outstanding, right? That the federal treasuries. It doesn't count any of the off-budget liabilities. It doesn't count any of the contingency liabilities, which are the biggest part. You know, a normal corporation, they account for their contingency liabilities. If they don't, it's illegal. You can go to jail if you don't disclose your contingency liabilities. But the U.S. government, doesn't do that. But if you don't know what a contingency liability is, I mean, the government is guaranteed, 90% of the mortgages. Some of those mortgages might actually go bad, believe it or not. And the government doesn't assume that any of them will go bad. But obviously, if we're guaranteed all those mortgages, you can statistically figure out what percentage of them are going to go bad, right? I mean, we guarantee all the FHA, all the Fannie and Freddie. So what about? Also, we have over $1 trillion worth of student loans. Over $1 trillion, and it's growing. And I got news for you. There are a lot of people, graduating from college, with $50,000 or $100,000 in debt that majored in sociology or philosophy or who knows what kind of liberal art major. I got news for you. They're not good for that debt. They're not going to pay it back. There are a lot of students that are not going to pay this debt back. Yet, not a single. The government doesn't put aside any money, anything contingent for that liability. And of course, the biggest ones are Social Security, Medicare. So I mean, you add all that stuff together, and you're talking like, I don't know, 50 to 100 trillion, 80 trillion. I see all kinds of different estimates. They're all so enormous. I don't know which one is exact, but it's a huge, huge number. And the 16 trillion that we all talk about is the tip of that huge iceberg. But even that that debt that we have to service, we're paying a tiny amount of interest. Now, what would happen if interest rates went up? What would happen if interest rates went to, 5%? And the whole debt ultimately had to be at 5%. Well, if the debt was 20 trillion in a couple of years, which it probably will be, 5% of 20 trillion is $1 trillion. Well, how are we going to pay $1 trillion a year in interest payments? That's more than 3 times what we pay now. I mean, could you really add $650 billion per year in spending? And what if, who says interest rates stop at 5%? What if they go to 10%? I mean, they're at 7% now in a lot of parts of Europe. There are countries that have better finances than us are paying 7% to borrow money. But if we had to pay 10%, that's half of what we paid in 1980 when Reagan was president. But what if we had a 10% interest payment on a $2 trillion debt? That's $2 trillion a year in interest. Is it possible that we can pay $2 trillion a year in interest? We only collect about $2.5 trillion in taxes. But think about this. If interest rates were 10%, how much tax revenue would the government collect? I don't even think they'd get, they might even get $1.5 trillion. How many people would still be employed if interest rates were 10%? Where would the housing market be if mortgage rates were? Where would the banks be? I mean, most of them would have failed. I mean, the truth of the matter is, the reason that the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates at zero is not because it helps the economy. It actually hurts the economy. It's because it props up the banks. It props up the federal government. Without these artificially low interest rates, the government would have to default on its debt, just like Greece did. Without these artificially low interest rates, the banks would fail. I mean, where do you think mortgage interest rates are the lowest they've ever been? You can get a 30-year mortgage now at like 3 1/4, 3 3/8. And the market is still going down. Imagine where it would be if mortgage rates were at normal levels. But obviously, nobody bothers to think about the consequences of interest rates being at zero, as if it's all, it's all positive. Everybody thinks about, oh, it's great for the borrower. Yeah, it's great for the borrower, but it's not that good for the lender. Because whatever the borrower gains, the lender loses. And how can you have interest rates at zero and not think about the repercussions? I mean, when interest rates were too low in the 90s, we got the stock market bubble. When they were too low in this decade, or the 2000s, we got the housing bubble. Low interest rates are a big part of the problem. In fact, when Ben Bernanke announced QE3, he actually told us why they were doing it. He gave us their thinking. He told us, what the brains, what their rationale was for QE3. And in fact, I almost fell off my chair when they basically said it. And this was their plan. They came up. I don't know how long it took them to come up with this genius plan. But this was the rationale. This is what Ben Bernanke said. He said, we got this great idea for QE3. We're gonna buy up a bunch of mortgages. Basically, we're going to print money and buy mortgages. And we're going to do that so mortgage rates will go even lower than they are now. And that will make it easier for people to buy homes. And if people can buy homes, well, then the real estate prices will go up. Because people can get lower mortgages, they can pay more for houses. And that'll cause real estate prices to go up. And now people will feel better because they'll feel richer because their house is more valuable. And they'll go out and spend more money. And in fact, we'll build more houses because the home builders will realize that they can make more money selling houses. So we'll have more people building houses. And then houses go up in value. People will be able to borrow money and spend that. And we're going to create a recovery based on rising housing prices. I'm thinking to myself, are they kidding me? I mean, isn't that exactly what they just did? Isn't that was their whole policy? They gave us the housing bubble. And that's all they've got? This is what they came up with. Is another housing bubble. And I think it's even amazing, too, because when the Federal Reserve was asked, if they felt, Ben Bernanke, does the Fed bear any responsibility for the housing bubble, right? And Ben Bernanke would always say, no. He said low interest rates had nothing to do with real estate prices going up, which of course is ridiculous. Of course, they had everything to do with it. The Fed was the principal cause of the housing bubble. But Ben Bernanke said, no, our low interest rate policies, low interest rates do not cause home prices to rise. But now, he's basically saying, we're going to lower interest rates to make real estate prices go up. Well, which is it? Do low interest rates make real estate prices go up or not? I mean, they can't have it both ways. In fact, the Fed always wants to have it both ways when it comes to QE, because the Fed prints all this money and then takes credit for the stock market going up. Takes credit for real estate prices going up, but it says oil prices going up, food prices going up. Hell, it has nothing to do with my monetary policy. Well, how is the Fed has such laser beam control with its inflation that it can point it directly at housing and make sure none of it slips into oil, none of it goes into food. Food, that's all about the weather. It's got nothing to do with our monetary policies, or oil is about OPEC or whatever it is. But the Fed is always lying, and it never tells you its real reason, which is what I was talking about with the low interest rates. What the Fed is trying to do is prop up the housing market, prop up the banks. If the Fed let real estate prices fail, I mean, a lot of these big banks that they bailed out, the government likes to take credit for TARP working. TARP didn't work. All those banks that were too big to fail are even bigger now, and they're still going to fail. It's just going to cost us a lot more money when they do, because all these big banks are even more levered up now. And how are the banks profiting. What they do is they borrow money from the Fed at practically nothing, and they turn around and lend it to the government, either directly by buying treasuries, or indirectly by buying mortgages. But it's still government money, because basically the government is on the hook for all the home loans. They're basically the same as treasuries. And in fact, a lot of people will criticize the banks. They'll say, look, the banks aren't lending any money out. Sure they are. They're lending out plenty of money to the government. I mean, where do you think the government's getting all this money? They're not collecting it in taxes. They got to get it from somewhere. Yeah, the Fed is printing a lot of it and buying government bonds, but the Fed isn't buying all the bonds. Banks are buying a lot of those bonds. But when you buy a government bond, you're making a loan. You're making a loan to the government. Well, if you loan the money to the government, you can't loan it to an entrepreneur because the money's not there anymore. So businesses can't get loans because the government is borrowing up all the money. And the bigger the deficits are, the less capital that is available for entrepreneurs. So we can't grow the economy, we grow the government instead. And so if interest rates were allowed to rise, what would happen to these banks? Well, if I'm a bank and I've got all these 30-year mortgages on my books or 30-year treasuries that are yielding 3 or 4%, what happens to me when my cost of funds is 5% or 6%? Well, I'm going to go bankrupt. So they have to keep the interest rates down. See, the Fed keeps pretending that these low interest rates are temporary, that they can raise them. How can they raise them? It's impossible. The Fed is buying all these mortgages. How can they sell them? Sell them to who? Who's going to want to step in front of that trade? If the Fed says, the Fed announces, okay, we're going to shrink our balance sheet, we're going to start selling mortgages, who's going to put their hand up to buy them? Nobody's going to want to buy. The Fed is the biggest buyer. Same thing with Treasury. So it's like they can expand the balance sheet. That's why I call it like the Roach Motel of balance sheets, because they can check in, but they can't check out. They're the market. They're the buyers. And if they ever let interest rates go up, now we got a much bigger problem because we're deeper into debt because of their policy. Like that, they'll say, well, the federal government should take advantage of all this low interest rates, right, and borrow more money. Right? Well, wait a minute, but we got to pay the money back. Just because something is cheap doesn't mean you should do it. I mean, if they're giving away free heroin, doesn't mean you should line up and take it. So, well, look, it's free, And of course, it's not even free. We still have to pay it back. So why borrow the money and blow it? And now we're committed to having to pay it back with interest. But the biggest part of it is the government is not borrowing for 30 years. Most of the new government bonds that are being sold are short maturities. They're a year or less. In the next year, something like a third of the national debt actually matures. How much is a third of 16 trillion? What's that, 6 trillion? Or, yeah, I mean, where are we going to go? That's 5 trillion, right? Yeah, 4 trillion. No. But where are we going to get that money? Right? I mean, the government only collects 2.5 trillion, 2.7 trillion, something like that in taxes. How are we going to pay back $5-6 trillion? Now, most people would say, well, Peter Schiff is always talking about, we don't have to pay that money back. Well, why not? We borrowed it. We don't have to pay it back. Well, our plan is to borrow the money to pay it back. And in fact, we're planning on borrowing it from the same people who loaned it to us. Right? That's our plan. Well, I mean, do you know anybody else who had a plan similar to that plan? Yeah, he's in jail right now. Bernie Madoff, that was his plan. And it didn't work for Bernie. I mean, it worked for a while, just like the government's plan. In fact, it was a funny thing because they actually interviewed Bernie Madoff after he was in jail. And one of the things he actually said was that he said, the federal government was running the biggest Ponzi scheme in the world. And the newspapers basically dismissed it because they said, oh, he's Bernie Madoff. I mean, he doesn't have any credibility, right? Well, he's got credibility about one thing. Right? Ponzi schemes. I mean, he knows a Ponzi scheme when he sees one. So if Bernie Madoff says the government's running a Ponzi scheme, you should listen to him. But that's what our plan is. Our plan is to borrow the money from the people who loaned it to us. Well, what if they don't want to do that? You see, the idea is that we never have to pay the money back, right? Every economist will tell you that we never have to pay back the national debt. Well, do our creditors know that? Because if we never have to pay it back, what we're basically saying is, well, our creditors will never get paid back, right? Why would they want to loan us the money if we're never going to pay it back? right? Because that's the real important part of the whole lending process, right? It's to get paid back. Anybody can make a loan, right? The key is to make a loan where you can get your money back. But then they'll say, well, of course we'll pay them back. We'll pay them back by borrowing more money. But that's not how you pay people back. In fact, when we had the argument about raising the debt ceiling, the politicians were saying we have to raise the debt ceiling to show the world that we're serious about paying our bills. Paying our bills, if we were serious, we wouldn't have raised the debt ceiling. We'd actually pay the bills. You don't pay your bills by borrowing more money. That's how you avoid paying your bills. Right? It's like I'm going to pay my Visa with my MasterCard. Well, how is that paying? You're just going into debt. The truth of the matter is we needed to leave the debt ceiling alone. That would be a signal to the world that we were going to pay our bills. But bring me to my point on Ponzi schemes. See, at least Bernie Madoff knew enough to keep it quiet. I mean, when you're running a Ponzi scheme, you don't want anyone to know it's a Ponzi scheme because it kind of screws up the whole scheme if you let people know about it. Well, we actually told the world that we were running a Ponzi scheme. And they didn't care. If you remember, during the discussions about raising the debt ceiling, you had the President of the United States, you had the Secretary of the Treasury, and the Federal Reserve, all three came out and said, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to have to default on our debt. And this would be a disaster. America has never defaulted. Of course, we did default in 1971, and we promised to pay the world gold for our dollars, and then we defaulted and paid nothing. But since then, we haven't defaulted. And so they said, this would be terrible if America defaulted. But wait a minute. I mean, this is the stupidest thing that you could do. We're telling our creditors exactly where they are in the totem pole, that they're the low man. And basically what we're saying is, if we can't borrow any more money, then we're not going to pay back any of the money we've already borrowed. Well, that's an admission that it's a Ponzi scheme. Because this was a lending ceiling. This was a self-imposed ceiling where we're not going to borrow. But basically, what would happen if, instead of the debt ceiling, there was a lending ceiling? What if our creditors said, America, we've loaned you all the money we're willing to loan you. We don't want to loan you any more money. What would happen under that scenario? Well, we already told them, we'll default. The minute the world stops lending, we stop paying back, right? We'll borrow money. As long as you're willing to lend it to us, we'll pretend we're going to pay you back. But the minute you stop lending, then the game is over because we can't pay anything back. That's basically what we admitted during that problem. I thought that was the stupidest thing. I mean, we didn't go out. The president didn't go on television and say, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to have to cut Social Security. We're going to have to cut Medicare. We're going to have to cut government salaries. We're going to have to cut government pensions because we're going to have to come up with the money so that we can pay the Chinese and pay the Saudis and pay the Japanese. We borrowed money, and we're Americans, so we're good for our debts, and we're going to have to make some sacrifices. The president didn't say we're going to have a 20% or 30% surcharge on the income tax because we have to pay our bills. Because that's not what he said. If we can't borrow more money, we're just going to default. But no one seemed to care. And if you want to go from the absurd to the ridiculous, or when S&P finally downgraded U.S. government debt, right? And of course, S&P, S&P, Moody's, these are the same guys that had subprime mortgages rated AAA right to the point where they defaulted, right? So they finally get around to downgrading the U.S. government to AA+, which is still much too high a grade for the U.S. But they downgraded to AA+. And the initial shockwave from that, right? People were panicking. The stock market was going down. People were afraid that the U.S. Treasury market had been downgraded. And so investors sought out safety. And so they rushed into U.S. Treasuries. They bought the very asset that was being downgraded, that was the cause of their fear. I mean, think about that. How can treasuries be a safe haven from treasuries? Right? Now, how long can that go on? Right? I mean, we have the internet bubble, we have the real estate bubble. We know that people do stupid things, but they don't do stupid things forever. Right? Are people always going to feel this way? Are they always going to regard the dollar as a safe haven, as treasuries as a safe haven, even though they're clearly not. You know, the problems that are going on in Europe right now, it's all about sovereign debt. It's all about governments that have spent too much money and borrowed too much money and now are confronted with the reality that they can't pay. And what was the event that precipitated all of these crises? It was rising interest rates. When interest rates were low, Spain didn't have a problem. Italy didn't have a problem. Greece didn't have a problem. I mean, they had a problem, it just wasn't apparent because they could cover it up, because rates were still low, because creditors still had confidence, even though they shouldn't have. But at some point, people wake up. People realize that, condos in Vegas, aren't going to, keep on going up, or these money-losing internet companies aren't going to keep on going up. I mean, eventually, that mentality changes. The stimulus wears off, and you think straight. When government, shoots everybody up with cheap money, their heads, they don't think right. That's what happens. I mean, George Bush was half right when he talked about Wall Street being drunk. Or maybe he was a quarter right, because it wasn't just Wall Street that was drunk, it was the whole country that was drunk. But that's where his analogy stopped. He didn't complete it and say, well, why were they so drunk? Where'd they get all that alcohol? Right? He doesn't say, well, wait a minute. Al Greenspan was the bartender. He liquored everybody up, and they did stupid things. And then when the alcohol wears off, interest rates go up, people realize the stupid things. Well, some of the stupid things were done here, like buying the .coms or subprime mortgages. Well, people in Europe did stupid things too, like buying a lot of Greek bonds, loaning a lot of money to Greece. Even though it should have been obvious 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that it was impossible for Greece to pay the money back. Nobody cared. Right? And you got extra basis points, you got extra yield. That was the same reason people were buying these subprime mortgages, because they got a couple hundred extra basis points in yield. That's why everybody was chasing yield. Nobody cared about risk because they were all drunk. Everybody was, all the cheap money, nothing could go wrong. But all of a sudden, somebody maybe is sitting around with some Greek paper and thinking it over. Maybe he's talking to his friend. He says, you think the Greeks are good for this debt? Maybe someone said, no, they're not good for it. And then so they stop showing up at the auctions. And then interest rates go up. And then when interest rates go up, it's like a light going off. Because now as interest rates go up, it accelerates the insolvency. Because now the cost of servicing your debt is going up. So that's putting even more pressure on your budget. So it's all about confidence and interest rates. Well, what about us? Isn't there going to be a point when America's creditors come to the same conclusion as the Greek creditors, or the Spanish creditors, or anybody's creditors, that we've borrowed beyond our capacity to repay? I mean, we've already done that. It's already impossible. If we had to pay a market rate of interest on our debts, we would be insolvent right now. So that's why we have to keep interest rates at zero. But the problem is you can't keep them there indefinitely, because it is destroying the economy. I mean, think about the importance of interest rates. Right? Interest rates are probably the single most important price in the economy, because it's the price of money, and money is half of every transaction. So you would think that the most important price to get right is the price of money, and therefore we need the market to discover it. We don't want the government to pull it out of thin air and just pick it, price fix it. Right? We don't want the government setting the price of bread or the price of gasoline. Right? We want the market to figure out the appropriate price through supply and demand. See, that's why capitalism works and socialism doesn't. Because in socialism, there is no market mechanism for discovering a price. Some bureaucrat just guesses what he thinks the price should be. And when you do that, you have big shortages, you have surpluses, you have, imbalances in the economy. The free market sets the efficient price, and it sends the appropriate signals to the suppliers and the consumers, and behavior is modified, or prices reflect reality, and you get efficient allocations of resources. Well, we don't do that with interest rates. Again, I said interest rates are zero. That's great for the borrower, but it's a lousy deal for the lender. And so is it a surprise to anybody that our savings rate is as low as it is when interest rates are at zero? I mean, you'd have to be an idiot to save money when interest rates are zero. And why don't we manufacture? Why don't we have the capital? Because capital comes from savings. It comes from underconsumption. But who's going to do that when you're punished for saving? So we have an economy that's all screwed up precisely because interest rates are too low. All of our resources are misallocated. We consume too much, we borrow too much, we spend too much, we don't produce enough, we don't save enough, we have enormous trade deficits and current account deficits because interest rates are too low. And as long as they're kept too low, the problems are going to get worse and worse and worse. And the only way to solve the problems is to let interest rates go up. But if interest rates go up, the government has to default on its debts. Banks have to fail. Real estate prices have to come down. Investors have to lose money. But in order to try to prevent all that, the Fed maintains the very policy that is making all that necessary. And so in the meantime, all of the problems just get bigger and bigger. They don't get smaller. We're not even working on solving the problems. Right? We're just making the problems worse because we don't want to deal with the short-term reality of the pain of the solution. It's like somebody who's overweight, and maybe they know they're overweight, but they want to keep eating and they don't want to exercise because they don't want to deal with a diet because it's going to screw up their life. It's going to change, they can't do what they used to do. So they keep on eating. And that's the situation that we're in. But to think that, we can do it forever, we can't. Because the more we keep interest rates down, the more screwed up our economy gets, the more dependent we become on the world. People don't understand the degree to which America depends on the rest of the world. People think it's the other way around. They think the world depends on us. No. The world is producing all the stuff that we consume. They're lending us all the money that we borrow. They're supplying our economy with the things that we're incapable of producing. We're basically subsisting on the labor and savings of the rest of the world. And the more they do that, the more expensive it becomes for them because they just help create a bigger and bigger economy that's more and more dependent on their stuff. And if, the government is borrowing all this money, we just got, we had the jobs numbers came out again. I mentioned it earlier. And last month we created like 110,000 jobs. But we lost 12,000, 14,000 manufacturing jobs. We lost 22 manufacturing jobs a month before. What kind of jobs did we add? We added government jobs. We had service sector jobs. We can't afford these jobs. What are these government workers going to produce? Nothing. In fact, they're just going to make it harder for everybody else who is producing to produce anything. We're actually worse off because those jobs are created. And yet they're going to take these government paychecks to Walmart. They're going to buy all kinds of stuff that was made in China. And so the imbalances in the economy get bigger and bigger because the government is preventing the right kinds of jobs from being created because it's diverting capital to the wrong kinds of jobs. The government always wants to talk about, hey, look at all the jobs that the stimulus saved. Well, a lot of those jobs we shouldn't have saved. We need to get rid of them. It's a shame that the stimulus saved those jobs. We need to eliminate those jobs. We need to free up that labor to do something that the economy actually needs. We need work that will make us more productive. Because remember, all the politicians want to talk about jobs, that we need jobs. We don't need jobs. We need the things that we can buy because we have jobs. We need the productivity associated with jobs. We don't need the jobs. We don't need the work. We need the stuff. And the thing is, Obama is probably going to be very successful eventually in creating jobs. The problem is he's going to create jobs for the retired people. Right? They don't want jobs, but they're going to have jobs. Because they're not going to be able to stay retired anymore because they're going to be wiped out. In fact, a lot of people might end up having 2 or 3 jobs under Obama. Is that a good thing if people have to moonlight because their one job isn't pay enough to support their fit, so they got to get 2 or 3 jobs? No, so we don't need to create jobs. We want productive jobs. No one ever asked, okay, we created jobs. Doing what? What are they doing? What are the people making? Are they producing something? No, they're just shuffling papers around. So we're not getting the right kinds of jobs. So we get these jobs that exacerbate the problem. So at some point, we're going to hit a crisis. Right? At some point, the world is not going to show up at these auctions. Maybe it's because Europe gets its act together, or at least convinces the world that it's done that, maybe puts a Band-Aid on the problem long enough to get people not to worry about the euro so much and focus more on the dollar. Meanwhile, we are headed back